This 1902 portrait of two seamstresses looks calm until you see the thread on the floor. It seemed ordinary at first. Two young women seated at a work table, dressed in clean shirtwaists, their expressions polite but stiff for the camera. The kind of photograph you might expect to find in an old factory brochure or a city directory advertisement, until one detail would not let the investigator go. Her name was Margaret Holloway. She was a textile historian at a small labor museum near the Bowery, the kind of institution that survived on grants and the stubborn devotion of a handful of staff who believed that sewing machines and union buttons deserved the same reverence as paintings in gilded frames. She'd been cataloging a recent donation from the estate of a former garment manufacturer when she pulled the photograph from a brittle envelope. The image showed two girls, perhaps 16 or 17, seated at a narrow workbench. Scissors, spools, and half-finished shirtwaists surrounded them. Their hands were folded identically, resting on fabric in their laps. Behind them, a window let in gray light, and beside that window stood a rack of finished blouses. A handwritten caption on the back read, "Our Union Girls, 1902, Certified Labor." Margaret had seen hundreds of photographs like this one. They were common in the era, visual proof that a manufacturer was on the right side of the labor question. Consumers in those years were beginning to care where their clothes came from. The union label was becoming a mark of conscience, and manufacturers who could claim union labor often placed such photographs in their storefronts or pasted them into catalogs. Clean workrooms, smiling workers. The message was always the same, nothing shameful here. But something about this photograph nagged at her. The girls' posture was too rigid, their smiles too thin, and their feet were oddly positioned, angled toward each other, as though they were trying to hide something beneath the table. She scanned the image at high resolution and zoomed in on the floor. There, barely visible in the original print, a single thread ran from under the hem of the girl on the left. It was white, almost invisible against the pale floorboards. It curled across the floor, then disappeared under a spool sitting on a low shelf. Margaret would not have noticed it at all, except the spool was not ordinary. It had a small paper label wrapped around it, partially legible in the scan. She enhanced the image. 3 letters emerged, APW, and then, beneath those letters, a number, a shipping code. Margaret had spent years learning to read the hidden language of old garment photographs. She knew that manufacturers often reused spools, that thread colors had meanings, that workers sometimes left messages in their stitching. But she had never seen a prison shipping code on a spool inside a supposedly union-certified factory. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the girls' faces again. Now, their stiff posture seemed less like shyness. It seemed like fear. This was not just a pretty old photo. Something here was wrong. Margaret Holloway had worked at the Labor Museum for nearly 12 years. She had started as a graduate student, writing her dissertation on tenement homework in the Lower East Side, and never quite left. The museum was cramped and underfunded, its collection scattered across 3 narrow floors of a building that had once been a button factory. But its archives held treasures that larger institutions had ignored. Boxes of union contracts, ledgers from shirtwaist manufacturers, photographs of children pulling bastings from garments in windowless rooms. She was accustomed to photographs that told difficult stories. Images of 12-year-olds hunched over sewing machines, families crowded into single rooms making artificial flowers for pennies. The garment trade in early 20th century New York had been brutal, and Margaret had trained herself to see the brutality even when the photographs tried to hide it. But this photograph was different. The girls did not look like tenement workers. They were too clean, too carefully posed, and the factory behind them was too orderly. It looked like a showroom, not a workroom. That was the first clue. Real garment factories in 1902 were chaotic. Thread scraps on the floor, fabric piled in corners, workers crammed elbow to elbow. This photograph had been staged. She removed the print from its sleeve and examined the edges. There was a studio stamp on the lower right corner. Reinhardt and Sons, Commercial Photography, 14th Street. She made a note of it. Then she turned the photograph over and studied the handwritten caption again. Our Union Girls, 1902, Certified Labor. Beneath that, in lighter pencil, someone had written a second line. Approved for catalog, sent to printer. Margaret knew what this meant. The photograph had been commissioned for marketing purposes. It was meant to reassure consumers that the garments being sold were made by unionized workers in clean, legal factories. In 1902, the union label was not yet standardized. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union had only been founded 2 years earlier, and the great strikes that would reshape the industry were still years away. But reformers and consumers were already paying attention. The National Consumers League was publishing lists of manufacturers who met ethical standards. Department stores were beginning to ask questions about where their merchandise came from. A photograph like this one was worth money. It was proof of respectability. It said, "We are not one of those factories. We do not employ children. We do not use prison labor. Our girls are free workers, paid fair wages, protected by union contracts." But the thread on the floor told a different story. Margaret returned to the shipping code on the spool. APW. She opened her laptop and began to search. It took her less than an hour to find it. Auburn Prison Workshop. Auburn, New York, had been the site of one of the most notorious prison labor systems in the country. In the 19th century, the prison had operated as an industrial factory, forcing inmates to manufacture everything from barrels to shoes to clothing. Contractors paid the state for the use of prison labor, then sold the goods on the open market at prices that undercut free workers. The system had been widely condemned. Unions had fought against it for decades. And in 1894, New York State had passed a constitutional amendment banning the sale of prison-made goods in direct competition with private industry. But bans, as Margaret knew, were rarely absolute. She contacted a colleague at a university archive in Albany, a legal historian named Samuel Okonkwo, who specialized in prison labor contracts. She sent him the photograph and the shipping code. 2 days later, he called her back. "You found something interesting," he said. His voice was careful, the way academics spoke when they were trying not to get ahead of the evidence. "APW was definitely Auburn, and that number you sent me is a batch code. It corresponds to a shipment of thread manufactured at Auburn in late 1901 and early 1902. Manufactured by inmates? Almost certainly. The prison workshops produced commercial thread until 1903, when the last contracts were terminated. But here's the thing. After the 1894 ban, prison-made goods were supposed to be labeled. They weren't supposed to enter the consumer market without disclosure. And they definitely weren't supposed to be mixed with union-certified products." Margaret looked at the photograph again. The two girls sat at their work table, their hands folded, their eyes fixed on the camera. Behind them, the rack of finished blouses waited to be shipped, and on the floor, barely visible, the thread from Auburn Prison ran from their hems to the spool on the shelf. "Someone was faking the union label," she said. "That's what it looks like," Samuel replied. "But to prove it, you're going to need more than a photograph." The manufacturer's name was Eckstein and Lutz. Margaret found it in the estate paperwork that had accompanied the photograph. The company had operated a shirtwaist factory on Worcester Street from 1897 to 1911, producing blouses and skirts for department stores across the Northeast. It had advertised itself as a union-certified manufacturer, and its catalogs from the era featured photographs of clean workrooms and smiling workers. But the company's records told a more complicated story. Margaret spent a week in the city archives, pulling old business licenses, tax records, and court filings. She found that Eckstein and Lutz had been sued twice in 1903 for non-payment of wages. She found a complaint filed by the Consumers League alleging that the company had employed children as young as 11, and she found a curious notation in a ledger from 1902 listing payments to a company called Allied Thread Supply for specialized materials. Allied Thread Supply did not appear in any city directory. It had no storefront, no advertisements, no presence in the trade press, but it had received regular payments from Eckstein and Lutz for nearly 3 years. Margaret tracked the payments to a post office box in Brooklyn. Then she found a single reference in a newspaper clipping from 1904. A brief article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, buried on an inside page, reported that Allied Thread Supply had been cited by state inspectors for irregularities in product labeling. The company had closed shortly afterward. No charges were filed. She brought her findings to Samuel Okonkwo, who helped her trace the ownership of Allied Thread Supply through incorporation records. The company had been registered to a man named Frederick Lutz, one of the partners in Eckstein and Lutz. He was running a shell company, Margaret said, buying prison-made thread, stripping off the labels and reselling it to his own factory. And then putting the union label on the finished products, Samuel added. It's fraud, labor fraud, consumer fraud, probably violations of the 1894 ban. But in 1902, enforcement was almost non-existent. The state had maybe a dozen inspectors for the entire garment industry, and manufacturers like Eckstein and Lutz knew exactly how to avoid them. The system, Margaret was beginning to understand, had been far more elaborate than a single factory. Prison labor in New York had officially ended with the 1894 constitutional amendment, but the prisons still needed to keep inmates occupied, and the state still wanted to offset the cost of incarceration. So the workshops continued operating, producing goods that were sold not on the open market, but to state institutions, hospitals, and schools. Except some of those goods leaked out. Thread was particularly easy to hide. It was small, undifferentiated, and essential to every garment factory in the city. A spool of white cotton thread from Auburn Prison looked exactly like a spool of white cotton thread from any legitimate supplier. The only difference was the shipping code, and that could be removed with a razor blade. But there was more. The girls in the photograph were not just sewing with prison-made thread. They were sewing alongside prison-made thread. The photograph was staged, yes, but it was staged to hide something specific. Margaret returned to the image and studied it again. The girls' feet were still angled toward each other, still hiding something beneath the table. She zoomed in further, and then she saw it. Beneath the table, barely visible in the shadows, was a third pair of hands, small hands, a child's hands, holding a needle. The practice was called finishing. It was one of the most common forms of child labor in the garment industry. Manufacturers would send partially completed garments to tenement apartments where women and children would add buttons, pull bastings, sew on labels, and perform other simple tasks. The work was paid by the piece, at rates so low that entire families had to work 12 or 14 hours a day just to earn enough for rent. But finishing could also happen inside factories. Inspectors were supposed to check for child workers, but factories that knew when inspectors were coming could hide the children in back rooms, under tables, or behind racks of clothing. A photographer staging a promotional image would know exactly where to place his subjects to keep the children out of frame. Almost out of frame. Margaret contacted a children's welfare historian at a university in Boston, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Chen, who had spent her career studying child labor in progressive-era America. She sent her the photograph, along with her notes on Eckstein and Lutz. Dr. Chen's response came the next day. This is consistent with what we know about the industry, she wrote. Child labor in garment factories was rampant, despite the laws against it. But what's interesting about your photograph is the combination. Prison thread and child labor, both hidden in the same image, both covered by a union label. That suggests a very deliberate strategy. Someone was running a factory that violated every reform the movement was fighting for, and they were using the union label as camouflage. Margaret thought about the consumers who had bought shirtwaists from Eckstein and Lutz in 1902. They had seen the union label and believed they were supporting fair labor. They had looked at photographs like this one and believed they were seeing happy workers in clean factories. They had no way of knowing that the thread in their blouses had been spun by prisoners, or that the buttonholes had been stitched by children hidden under tables. The union label, in this case, was not a mark of conscience. It was a brand. She began to trace the connections outward. If Eckstein and Lutz had been faking union certification, they could not have been alone. The economics of the garment industry in 1902 demanded cheap labor. The 10 and 12-hour days, the piece rate wages, the constant pressure to cut costs. A manufacturer who played by the rules would be undercut by one who did not. And if one manufacturer discovered that prison thread could be laundered through a shell company, others would follow. She found references to similar schemes in old newspaper accounts. A factory in Newark cited for using irregular suppliers. a manufacturer in Philadelphia accused of mislabeling his products, a Consumers League report from 1905 that mentioned persistent rumors of prison goods entering the garment trade. The union itself had known. Margaret found a letter in the ILGW archives dated 1903 from a local organizer to the national office. The organizer reported that several factories claiming union certification were using thread and buttons from suspicious sources. He recommended an investigation. The national office replied that they lacked the resources to pursue every rumor. The system had been hiding in plain sight. Margaret brought her findings to the museum's director, a cautious administrator named Richard Weston, who had spent most of his career at larger institutions before landing at the small labor museum 5 years earlier. She laid out the photograph, the shipping codes, the corporate records, and the historical context. She explained what she believed the image revealed: a deliberate scheme to fake union certification using prison labor and hidden child workers. Weston listened carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This is significant," he said, "but it's also complicated." Complicated how? The donation came from the Lutz family, descendants of Frederick Lutz. They gave us this collection in good faith, along with a substantial financial contribution. If we publish your findings, we're essentially accusing their ancestor of fraud and child exploitation. Their ancestor did commit fraud and child exploitation. That may be true, but the family doesn't know that. They believe they're honoring a legacy of entrepreneurship and craftsmanship. If we go public with this, we risk losing their support, and we risk alienating other potential donors who might worry about what we'll find in their family histories. Margaret had expected this. Museums, she knew, were always caught between their missions and their donors. The Lutz family had given money, and money was never neutral. "The photograph is evidence," she said. "It documents a system that exploited prisoners, exploited children, and deceived consumers. That's exactly what this museum is supposed to preserve." "I understand that, but there are ways to present this information that are less confrontational. We could frame it as a broader story about labor fraud in the era without singling out any particular company or family. That would be a lie by omission." Weston was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me think about it. Give me a week." Margaret spent that week continuing her research. She found more shipping codes, more shell companies, more patterns of fraud. She tracked the thread from Auburn Prison through Allied Thread Supply to Eckstein and Lutz, and from there to department stores across the Northeast. She found advertisements from 1902 showing the same shirtwaists that appeared in the photograph, marketed to middle-class women as union-made and ethically produced. She also found something else. In the archives of the Consumers League, she discovered a list of factories that had been investigated for labor violations in 1904. Eckstein and Lutz was on the list. The investigation had been closed without action after the company provided satisfactory documentation of its labor practices. The documentation, Margaret realized, had probably included photographs like the one she held in her hands. At the end of the week, Weston called her into his office. Seated with him was a woman Margaret did not recognize, a board member named Patricia Lutz Harden, who was, it turned out, the great-granddaughter of Frederick Lutz. "Dr. Holloway," Weston began, "Mrs. Lutz Harden has reviewed your preliminary findings. She has some concerns." Patricia Lutz Harden was in her 60s, well-dressed, with the composed expression of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. She spoke carefully. "I understand that historical research sometimes uncovers uncomfortable truths, and I want you to know that my family has always believed in honesty and transparency. But I have to ask, how certain are you of these conclusions?" Margaret chose her words with equal care. "The shipping code on the spool matches records from Auburn Prison. The corporate records show payments to a shell company that existed only to launder prison goods, and the photograph itself shows evidence of hidden child labor. I can't prove intent without a confession, but the pattern is clear." "But patterns can be misinterpreted." "They can, but in this case, the evidence points in one direction." Patricia Lutz Harden looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she said, "My great-grandfather built that company. He employed hundreds of people. He supported charities, built a synagogue, gave to the community. I grew up hearing stories about his generosity and his integrity, and now you're telling me that he built that legacy on the backs of prisoners and children. I'm telling you what the records show. But records can be incomplete. They can be misleading. Isn't it possible that someone else in the company was responsible? That Frederick didn't know what was happening? Margaret had considered this. It was possible. But it was also, she thought, unlikely. Frederick Lutz had owned Allied Thread Supply. He had signed the incorporation papers. He had received the payments. If the fraud had been hidden from him, it had been hidden with extraordinary skill. I can't rule that out, she said, but I also can't suppress the evidence to protect his reputation. The room was silent. Weston looked uncomfortable. Patricia Lutz Harden looked at the photograph again, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw something shift in her expression, something like recognition or grief. My grandmother used to talk about the factory, Patricia said quietly. She never worked there, but she remembered visiting as a child. She said the workers were always busy, always moving. She said the machines never stopped, and she said there were children everywhere, children carrying bundles, children sweeping floors, children hiding under tables when visitors came. She paused. I always thought she was exaggerating. Children had wild imaginations in those days. But now I wonder if she was telling the truth. Margaret said nothing. What do you want to do with this? Patricia asked. I want to tell the full story, not to shame your family, but to honor the people in that photograph, the girls, at the table, the child under the bench, the prisoners who made the thread. They deserve to be remembered. Patricia Lutz Harden was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. All right, she said. Tell the story. The exhibition opened 6 months later. Margaret designed it around the photograph, which hung at the center of a wall devoted to labor fraud in the Progressive Era. Beside it, she displayed the shipping codes, the corporate records, and the Consumers League investigations. She included photographs of Auburn Prison and its workshops. She showed examples of the union labels that had been faked and the advertisements that had misled consumers. And she told the stories of the people in the photograph. The two girls at the table remained unnamed. Margaret had searched the census records, the factory rolls, and the immigration databases, but she could not identify them with certainty. They were probably immigrants, probably Jewish or Italian, probably between 15 and 18 years old. They had probably worked 12-hour days for wages that barely covered their rent. And they had probably never known that the thread they sewed with had been spun by prisoners, or that the label on their blouses was a lie. The child under the table was also unnamed. Margaret could only see her hands in the photograph, small and careful, holding a needle. She might have been 10 years old, or 12, or even younger. She had been hidden from the camera, hidden from the inspectors, hidden from the consumers who bought the clothes she helped make. She had been invisible, and she had remained invisible for more than a century. Until now. The exhibition included a section on prison labor, tracing the history of convict leasing and the constitutional amendments that were supposed to end it. Margaret showed how the 1894 ban in New York had been evaded, how shell companies had laundered prison goods, and how the garment industry had absorbed those goods into its supply chains. She quoted from the letters of union organizers who had suspected fraud but lacked the resources to investigate. She showed how the system had worked. Patricia Lutz Harden attended the opening. She stood for a long time in front of the photograph, looking at the girls and the thread and the child's hands beneath the table. Afterward, she approached Margaret. Thank you, she said, for telling the truth. Thank you for letting me. I've been thinking about my grandmother, about what she saw, and I've been thinking about what it means to inherit a legacy like this. My family benefited from that company. We lived in nice houses, went to good schools, had opportunities that other people didn't have, and all of that was built on something ugly. You didn't build it. No, but I inherited it, and now I have a choice about what to do with that inheritance. She paused. I want to establish a scholarship for the children and grandchildren of garment workers in honor of the people in that photograph. Margaret nodded. That would be meaningful. It won't undo what happened, but maybe it will help. The photograph of the two seamstresses now hangs in a permanent collection, reinterpreted. Visitors no longer see it as evidence of union virtue. They see it as evidence of fraud, of exploitation, of a system that hid its cruelty behind clean workrooms and smiling faces. But they also see something else. They see the thread on the floor. They see the child's hands beneath the table. They see the small details that tell the truth, even when the larger image lies. Old photographs are never neutral. They are composed, staged, edited. They show what someone wanted the world to see, and they hide what someone wanted the world to forget. The girls in the photograph were posed to look content. The factory behind them was arranged to look respectable. The union label on the blouses was meant to signal conscience and care. But the thread was real. The prison was real. The child was real. Across the country, in museum collections and family albums and antique shops, there are thousands of photographs like this one. Images of workers who look happy but whose hands tell a different story. Images of factories that look clean but whose floors are covered with evidence. Images of children who have been moved out of frame but whose shadows remain. Every photograph is a question, every detail is a clue, and every story that has been buried can, with patience and care, be brought back into the light. The thread on the floor still runs from the hems of those two girls to the spool on the shelf. It has been there for more than a century, and now, finally, we can see where it leads.